Instead of me introducing you guys, I'm going to go ahead and let you have the chance. So just start out, how did you get into blockchain or crypto, and what do you currently do in this space?
Okay. So my name is Parker Lewis. I am the head of business development at Unchained Capital, which is a Bitcoin-based financial services company here in Austin. We provide Bitcoin custodial solutions and we lend against Bitcoin. I got into Bitcoin. I was working at a global macro hedge fund in Dallas, doing a lot of work both historically on the financial crisis as well as trying to understand what was going to happen when the Fed unwound its balance sheet. And at that time, I was also starting to learn about Bitcoin. And really, as I did more research on the financial crisis and quantitative easing, and as I was learning about Bitcoin and understanding fundamentally how it works both at a technical level as well as an economic level, made the connection that the whole reason that Bitcoin exists is because of the financial crisis and because of quantitative easing. And so that really piqued my interest. I ended up leaving working a job at a hedge fund to come down here to Austin because there's just a lot of actual development going on. Justin is a friend of mine who spoke earlier, but in addition to Justin, there's a lot of core developers here in Austin. A lot of them are former UT grads, some of the people who are most respected in the industry. So moved down here, ended up joining Unchained, and are out there working on solutions to help people better secure their Bitcoin and to make Bitcoin more useful.
Well, first of all, I got to say that it's a lot more fun standing there and asking questions than sitting down here. So my name is Anand. I'm a faculty member at UT Austin at the McComb School of Business. And I'm a very old AI data researcher, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life in healthcare. And I really looked at blockchain along with AI techniques as a way to transform healthcare in the US from a black box to a glass box. So I'm really very passionate about healthcare applications, and I feel blockchain is one tool that can help along with other tools.
My name is Cesare Fracassi. I am a finance faculty at the Guarav School of Business here at UT. I do research and teach financial technology, and I'm also the director of the blockchain initiative here on campus. So I basically oversight all the initiatives on blockchain here on campus, trying to increase the curriculum teaching on blockchain technology, funding and giving funds to faculty and PhD students. Thank you. Providing funding to faculty and PhD students that want to do projects, research projects on blockchain, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I'm Guarav Chawla. I'm a VP and fellow at Delhi EMC. I focus on, my primary focus areas are edge computing, IoT, and blockchain. And I also focus on what we call hyper-converged infrastructure, which is taking compute, storage, networking, bundling it all together as one integrated system along with the software frameworks so customers can run the applications they want on top of it. And my kind of, how I got into blockchain was as a company, a few years ago, we evolved into focusing on permissioned blockchain environments for enterprises and enterprise use cases. And we have our own blockchain platform, which is called the VMware blockchain, and it's also open sourced as Project Concord. That's what got me into the blockchain space.
So Guarav, we can kick off this next question with you. I think today has shown that people are very opinionated on emerging technology. Blockchain, people see all different types of use cases and they agree or disagree. With the future of blockchain panel, what do you think is a future use case of blockchain that deserves more attention today?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think people talk about all different use cases. But, and this is my personal view, I think in the end it comes down to the key use cases that finally see some winning areas is where you're trying to transact something of value across the different parties that may not actually trust each other, whether they are different businesses or different people. But you need some kind of way of transacting any asset of value between them. And maybe Tej would like my use cases and answer in that space. The two key use cases that have intrigued me, one is this whole emergence of what we call data marketplaces that are emerging now. And a lot of it is coming from the AI, machine learning, deep learning world. As everybody is going towards digital transformation, there's more and more of applying artificial intelligence to different processes, whether it is business processes or whether we want to get to self-driving cars and drones and things like that, which are safe to ride in. But in the end, all of these AI systems are only as good as the data that's used to train them, and nobody has all the data out there to train the model so it's safe to use and it kind of handles all the cases. So there's an emerging use case of creating a data marketplace where different companies, different entities out there are able to share the data they have, exchange it, either sell that data or exchange it for other data sets of value and be able to create more and safer artificial intelligence system out there for us a decade from now. So I think that's one good use case. And the second use case that always intrigues me is this whole concept of decentralized IDs and verifiable claims, which even IBM talked about this morning. But that has a whole range of applications, whether we talk about exchanging assets of value, data marketplace, music industry, where you create music and you can share it and get royalties for it. But there's a whole set of use cases that come around that.
So I'm going to take a very unpopular view. All right? I think one of the biggest problems in society is confirmation bias. All right? So confirmation bias basically means that you have some kind of prior opinion, and then you go on the web trying to find all the evidence that confirms your prior opinion. All right? So we talked about, so I've seen a lot of speakers here talking about Bitcoin. And one of the problems that Bitcoin solves is the fact that the government is stealing our money by using inflation. You know, the government is overprinting the money, stealing the money from us. In fact, like 96% of the value of a dollar has been eroded by inflation since 1913. All right? And I'm going to challenge this opinion. All right? I'm an academic. I'm a financial economist. I'm not a macroeconomist. So I don't know too much about macroeconomics. But what I know is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of very serious economists that have been thinking about how much money do we need in society. So why do we need money? We need money because we need to exchange things. You know, I teach and I get the money because I provide a service, and then I'm going to use the money to buy food and support my family. So the big question in macroeconomics is how much money do we need to keep the economy flowing? All right? And so not me, because I'm not a macroeconomist, but people, like people with PhDs, the central bank, they are, they've been studying this issue for 100 years. They've been trying to think, how much money do we need in society? All right? And so up until 1972, people have been, we've been using a gold standard, and then we realized that the gold standard is not very flexible. And so we started to realize that maybe having fiat money that is not connected to a gold standard is probably a better solution. And so now, if you actually poll macroeconomists, they all, or the very, very large majority, tell you that it's not a good thing to go back to the gold standard. If you talk to Ben Bernanke, the former, chairman of the Fed. Basically, he studied very, very well the Great Depression in 1930s. And he came back to say, we had the Great Depression because we did not print enough money. All right? So what I'm telling you is that I don't want you to trust me. What I'm asking you is not to use a confirmation bias. I'm going to ask you to not just trust the expert, but read the experts. All right? So in the same way that 99% of the climate experts say that there is climate change, I'm going to tell you that 99% of the macroeconomic experts have been telling you that a world where there is a low inflation, about 4%, is probably the best optimal situation. All right? I'm not asking you to trust the expert, but I'm asking you to actually go and read Ben Markey's studies on the 1930s. So I'm asking you to inform yourself, not just listening to just one side, but to listening to all sides.
Thank you, Cesare. And Cesare and I were talking a little bit in the break about this. And I just want to reinforce what he said, because we have many students in the audience, and there are points of view that we need to challenge, and we need to seek contrary points of view, and only then can we come for ourselves to a point where we say, you know what, we believe this or we believe that. And that's the critical thinking that we want to make sure all our students have, and that's why we're trying to make that point. I really like the use case Guarav mentioned. But for a moment, I'm going to step back and talk about technologies that have come before blockchain. And all of those technologies had an inflection point where from that inflection point, there was mass adoption. And most of the time, the inflection point concerns ease of use. So if you look at email, I remember my days in graduate school where when we sent email to somebody, we had to actually give the whole address, go from this server to that server to that server to that server, and then get the email to this person. Similarly, when we had websites and they were all static and you had so much to stand a website up, I think the professors talk too much. Watch this. This is good? Yeah. Okay. So I feel we will, and what happened with email, I don't know if you all know this or not, but mass adoption of email happened when hotmail.com started, and now everybody could get an email, and you didn't have to be a computer science student to have an email address, and you no longer needed to know the whole path. You could just say something at something.com and you'd be good. The same thing happened with the internet. We didn't really have mass adoption until we had the browser. The internet existed way before then. And then once we had the browser and common people could actually go to that browser and use the internet, and then we were able to build all the DNS farms behind the scenes so every web address could get resolved instantaneously, we had an internet. So for the future cases of use cases of blockchain, and even for some of the current use cases of blockchain, we will need such an inflection point. I don't know what that inflection point is, but I feel like if we are doing research, if we are looking for projects, it's that inflection point that we should look for, which is what is it that makes it easy to use, where it is not just the technologists or the people who have a certain point of view about the world economy or about the gold bug or about cryogenics who are using this, but it's the masses of people that can use it. So I feel like that's the inflection point we need. In terms of use cases, we have to look for use cases where there are central parties who has stopped playing fair. who have amassed inordinate amounts of power. And by the way, I will again, like Cesare, be a contrarian and say that that's not always the government. Governments are not separate from society. Governments are created by society. And we have the governments that we deserve, okay? So, however, so separating that central power, there are marketplaces where there's an inordinate amount of power created by central parties. By the way, that could be Google, okay? That could be Facebook. So it's not always the government that's the central authority that's abusing its power. And I just make the battery go away. I don't know this. I used to say that I have a magnetic personality, and all electronics goes haywire. But those are the kinds of use cases I would say where we make it easy to use and we find problems that have a benefit, but there is one or more central authorities that have an inordinate amount of power and they're abusing that power.
So I would take the view that despite the fact that the only application of a blockchain that is really working and that people are using today is in the context of money, I also believe that it is the only thing that works, that a blockchain really only, I guess I'll be the minority on this panel, but Justin shared the view before, that given the architecture, a blockchain was one piece of a puzzle that was designed to solve a problem, which was money by central authority. The blockchain was designed to distribute such that the system did not rely on trust. And I also support, and I think that everyone should go back and do their reading, because this is what led me to Bitcoin in the first place, which was I went back and read Ben Bernanke. I went back and read every single transcript that the Fed released during and after the financial crisis. And one of the things that I think everybody needs to understand is the problem of money is a big one. And over the course of the 20th century, there was a debate about whether or not the government should have an active role in the money supply. And the party that thought it should won, and the consequence of that has been a monoculture, both in the Central Bank of the United States, as well as virtually every academic institution in the United States or Western Europe. And Mises and Hayek and the Austrian school is just not taught. And that what we had in the 20th century was an economic debate, and one side won, and the two sides can't coexist. And now what we have in Bitcoin is honest competition. If the money via central authority and dictate works, you can have your financial system and keep it. But Justin brought up this point, and it's a very simple test that if you're faced with two possible solutions, one that being compensated for your time, energy, effort in a form of money that is reliably scarce, or a form of money that is very predictably manipulated by the government, which one do you choose? And that's what we're seeing in a market test now. And so I do encourage everyone to do the research both on Bitcoin and blockchain, but to understand that we've put that faith in our institutions. And when you do go back and read the transcripts, so the Fed releases transcripts 5 years after the meetings. So each meeting is about 280 pages. And if you go back and read it, when they're actually having the discussions around, are we going to print $1 trillion or are we going to print $2 trillion? They admit their limitation and their lack of understanding of the consequences, and they do it anyways. So, and that's just the fact. It's in the record. So I do encourage people to go back and read it, but the thing that I would leave you with is Bitcoin is specifically a problem or a solution to a problem of money, most people don't question what money is. They take it for granted. And I think because that is a massive problem, it should be, a much larger focus among the blockchain community than it is.
Well,
Can I answer?
please.
So, first, I don't want to be the part of the government, but I would like to tell you what usually macroeconomists think about this with this type of objections. So first of all, the Fed is an independent agency. So the idea that the government is printing money and stealing the money away from us regular people, it's like then you have to think about if that's true, you may have to think that all the people in the FMOC and all the people that are around the Fed are all in this giant conspiracy theory to actually take the money away from you. All right? And that is hard to believe. Not only them, all the macroeconomists in all the top schools, including UT Austin, they're all in this conspiracy theory to steal the money away from you. All right? Which is, in my opinion, hard to believe. Second of all, look, if it's true that it would be good to have a stable, fixed supply of money, let's say, nowadays there are $1 trillion of banknotes around the world. Let's assume that we want to just keep that. We're going to keep $1 trillion of banknotes in the world. We can do that. There is nothing technologically unfeasible in just saying, you know what, we're going to keep this supply of money constant. The reason why we don't do that, the reason why we add a little inflation, 2-3%, is because the macroeconomists have been thinking very, very carefully for hundreds of years about the benefits and costs of having inflation. And so the large consensus, and I'm talking about 95 to 95% of the economists, believe that having a slight amount of inflation is good for the economy. And if we didn't believe that, then we could just keep the supply of money constant. Now, it's true there are some countries like Venezuela and hyperinflation in Germany and so on, the government was actively printing money and taking the value away from even neoclassic economics says that hyperinflation is bad. But overall, especially here in the US, we know that if we can keep a moderate level of inflation, that's better than having zero inflation or actually negative inflation, because with Bitcoin you actually get negative inflation, you have deflation. All right? So what I'm saying is that try to think very carefully about what are the benefits and what are the costs of having inflation. And read the people that talk about why do we print so much money during the Great Recession? Why do we expand the balance sheet to $2 trillion with the Fed? Well, that's because we learned the lesson of the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, we did not print enough money, and then we had like 7 years of negative growth rate. And so I also agree with you that we don't know everything about how we create inflation. The short-term generation of inflation is still something that we don't understand. It's true that it's not that we have a magic pill, we know exactly what works and what doesn't work. But we have theories and we have some evidence over the past of something that might work and something that might not work. And just because we don't have all the answer, it doesn't mean that we just keep the money supply stable.
Cesare, Parker, you both have...
I'm sorry if I'm hijacking the topic of the discussion.
Not at all, not at all. Your input was great. But it's clear that y'all have different viewpoints, but you both mentioned doing your own research, right? You at least alluded to it. And with the audience being predominantly students, and the interest is there for this conference, where does somebody start that wants to get into blockchain and crypto, or what skills should they acquire in college to then join the industry?
So Matt, I'll take that and then I'll pass it on to everyone. And I'm actually going to try to move the conversation away from the economics and more of technology as a tool. So what we've seen so far is as new technologies have come, they have provided a level of business benefit. They've contributed to increased productivity. They've contributed to societal well-being. They've contributed, in some instances, to democratization and things like that. And then at some point in the evolution of those technologies, they get hijacked or they get taken over by powerful interests and they lose that trajectory. So for students who are getting into blockchain, what I advise is you always start from the business. What are the inefficiencies in the business that the technologies today do not take care of? And by the way, the exchange of money across borders, the transfer of money from one party in one currency to another party in another currency, the long settlement times, those are sources of inefficiencies that the current technology doesn't solve. Similarly, there are other inefficiencies in the business related to the redundancy of work, the reconciliation of redundant work and data. The issues we have today with security, fraud, and privacy, it's some of them exacerbated by existing technology and some of them exacerbated by powerful interests. So in my mind, blockchain has the potential to address some of these problems. And I would always advise people to start with what is the problem we are solving and how do we apply the tools we have to solve the problem. And my worry is that if we don't start with what are we trying to solve, but hey, we got X and that's going to solve everything, then we have the hammer and everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, so I think looking at the constitution of this panel, I'm guessing that even in the audience, we got both technology and the business-focused students. And I would say my advice would be on the technical side, the world's going more global, and so is all the use cases and the technologies associated with it. And I think the key thing to pay close attention to is that as we look at building the frameworks and technologies for the future, the most important aspects to pay attention to is, one is whatever we build got to be able to scale. And there is privacy and security aspects that are associated that go along with that global scale when we are trying to build distributed systems. And the third aspect which goes back to Tej's earlier comment, is that we want systems that are easy to use, have lower cost of ownership. So having the whole visualization and operational aspects that goes along with these distributed systems. So I think if I summarize, it's building systems for that scale, that have security and privacy, and then you address the operational and the cost of ownership aspect that's on the technical side. And on the business side, I would say the blockchain came along, and with that came along this whole aspect of having tokens and token sales and issues and aspects that go with it. So on the business side, anytime any kind of system is built that industry wants to monetize around, the business people needs to be guided for why would somebody pay money for this particular platform or product in the long run, and how would it have sustainable value? And the whole token sales and those things are kind of a key example of that.
Very quickly, I think blockchain is a mix between computer science economics and business. And so if you're a student, I think you need to know foundation of cryptography and coding for smart contracts. Economics, you need to have a basic understanding of micro and macroeconomics, how people respond to incentives. And from the business side, you need to understand, as Tej and Guarav said, what are the main frictions in the country, in the economy, and how we can reduce the friction using blockchain.
So recognizing that there are a lot of engineering students in the audience, one thing that I'd like to bring up, I mean, Justin was up here earlier, there are in Austin some of the foremost experts in Bitcoin programming. Justin and another guy, Jimmy Song, probably anywhere in the world, the two guys who are out there educating and teaching people specifically Bitcoin programming are right here in Austin. In addition to that, there are a couple, I think, probably top 100 Bitcoin developers in the world. Andrew Polstra, Brian Bishop, both live here in Austin. They are both UT students. There are a credible number of resources of people in the Austin community. I believe Jimmy teaches a class here.
Jimmy will teach next semester.
Yeah, so the resources that are here, both former alumni of UT as well as people that live in Austin, we're saturated with experts specifically on the computer science side, and it's worth engaging with those people because one of the profound things, again, tying it back to Bitcoin, is I think the social problem that's combined with the computer science problem that solve digital scarcity, which I think should be a really interesting problem for any engineering student to think about, because everything prior to Bitcoin that lived in the digital world was not scarce. And the technical aspects behind that allow that to happen only exist kind of in conjunction with the currency itself. So I would suggest Jimmy Song wrote a book called Programming Bitcoin. I have not read that book because I cannot yet conquer elliptic curve math, but Andreas Antonopoulos wrote another book called Mastering Bitcoin, which may be a better starting place if you're interested in learning about the technical aspects of Bitcoin, and then if you are interested in the economics of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Standard.
Parker, oh my God, I don't know how to parse this. You read all the Fed minutes and you didn't read Jimmy's book? Just teasing,
I've committed to Jimmy that I'm going to read the book and make a PR to Bitcoin Core sometime in the next decade.
I'll add one more quick comment. The reason we have so many blockchain platforms out there today that you come across so many startups, if you look around, who are building their own blockchain platform, claiming they have improved consensus algorithms, or they have better security, privacy, or they have better operationalization, better scale. And I think what we're going to see moving forward in the next 2 years is we're going to see consolidation of these platforms, because not all these platforms are going to win. There'll be few that people would rally around, and then you would need interoperability and apps that can run on top of each of these platforms. And that goes back to that fact of building platforms that can scale. And a lot of people would argue for Bitcoin that Bitcoin is Twitter for your bank account, because you can see all the transactions, and there are people out there that would claim that. So in the end, I think it goes down to build systems that scale. Otherwise, you're going to see consolidation, and you're going to see proliferation of too many competing platforms out there.
And by the way, Justin said that if we have too many competing platforms, then crypto is no longer scarce.
So it's clear we have a lot of knowledge up here and a lot of different backgrounds as well. There hasn't been a lot of time for questions in all these sessions, so I want to open the floor to anyone out there in the audience that would like to ask them a question. It seems like we have one over here. We could start there.
I know that we've been moving slowly away from the economic side, but I kind of want to pose a challenging question for our two economists, if you will, and it's going to be one per. For Parker, I was wondering, you talk about how, as a Bitcoin purist, you think that this transfer of value is the primary driver and the only thing valuable that comes out of blockchain, and that it's really a currency first. But I guess from my background, which is in data science, there is significant value in data, and the internet is built on data. For example, if we just look at your medical history, if it gets compromised, it's roughly worth a Bitcoin or a little bit more. And there are 300 million, 350-ish million people in the United States. That's quite a lot of value. How would you reconcile the massive value that data can have, both known and unknown, with kind of this Bitcoin purist stance?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the engineering question, which is, can a blockchain serve its function in a world that exists without a currency? And so the reasoning behind that is that the problem that you just described is also a big problem, but the question is, can a blockchain solve it? And from my lens of both understanding the technical protocol, even though I'm not an engineer, as well as the economics, is that immutability is not an inherent property of a blockchain. Immutability is a critical function of a blockchain. If you have a data set and it is insecure, what good is that data set? And that's where Bitcoin, the currency, comes in. Justin mentioned this in his talk, but when it comes to a blockchain, the blockchain was a structure to specifically remove trusted third parties. And the integrity of that chain and the ability to pay for security of it is dependent on money. But a blockchain cannot enforce anything that exists outside of it. The world of Bitcoin or the world of Ethereum or the world of any blockchain knows nothing about the outside world. All it can do is enforce the ownership of the bearer asset, the token themselves. So the way that I view the problem is, you need a blockchain, it needs to be immutable. In order to pay for the security, you need the currency, and that's why, in my perspective, it's not really all about Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin does not work without its blockchain, and its blockchain does not work without Bitcoin. And ultimately, because money converges to a single medium, it's very difficult to compete with Bitcoin because Bitcoin is also the most secure network and the most liquid.
And then my question for Cesare, I guess you're talking a lot about macroeconomists' views and how they generally have converged on certain answers. And in some ways, it may be even contrary to other fields of science. I know, for example, if we look at social psychology, one of the biggest things they've ever discovered is that localized wealth inequality is one of the biggest predictors of violent crime. And I guess playing off of what Justin was showing, there's been a massive change in how compensation versus productivity is rewarded, and usually that's especially skewed towards this kind of Pareto type distribution of wealth. So I was wondering if you could quickly give an overview of what macroeconomists generally consider the top things that they're optimizing for when they talk about a good model, and what may be some shortcomings in there.
That's a great question. So income inequality is something that economists have been looking at over the last 10, 15 years. I think it's an important and crucial problem in our society. Has income inequality been driven by living the gold standard? I really don't think so. I mean, again, not a macroeconomist, but I don't think that exiting the gold standard led to high income inequality. I think, in my view, high income inequality is driven by the evolution of technology, how nowadays there are so many network externalities, so that now just one single platform can basically capture all the rents in the economy. And so the owners, the Mark Zuckerbergs, and the owners of these highly centralized platforms are going to actually reap all the benefits from this monopolistic position. So I agree with you, income inequality is crucial. I think economies should do more trying to think about how to not just increase the pie, but also how you distribute the pie. I also have another comment about trust. It seems like most of the Bitcoin maximalists, the argument is, look, we want to design a system that doesn't require any level of trust. And the problem with this view is that if you want to design a system that doesn't need any trust at all, then you end up with a system that is totally self-referential. The only thing you can do is trust whatever is within that system. But that limits dramatically the usability of that system. So much so that at the end, if you only want to have absolute lack of trust, then you cannot use it for anything except for maybe means of exchange. And what I'm saying is that if you look at the internet, for example, the internet requires trusts. So you have what's called certificate of authority, that these are centralized places that certify that when you log in on Google, it's really Google. So even the internet, which is decentralized, requires some level of trust. You have to trust that the certificate of authority gives you the right certificate so that you know that when you connect to Google, Google is really Google and not somebody else. So my point is that, look, in order to make tools that are useful for society, we need to have some level of trust, some level. And if we want to find the perfect system that doesn't need any trust at all, ever, we will never be able to use any blockchain at all. But also, I don't think that's the aim of what here we're trying to make the world better. And so, in my view, blockchain technology is a very helpful technology because it allows us to verify. So remember the usual saying, trust and verify? Well, the more you can verify, and the more you can trust. And so what blockchain technology allows us to do, it allows us to verify more. And if we verify more, we can also trust more. And so when it comes to, we cannot use oracles because then you have to trust the outside person. Yes, it's a better solution though than not actually trusting anyone. And so even today in the internet, we trust the oracle, which is the certificate of authority. And the internet works pretty well, and it created an enormous amount of wealth in our country. And so my point of view is, it's not that we just need to design a system that is absolutely trustless. I'm very happy to have marginal improvement in our level of trust by using a system that, yes, relies on oracles like the internet.
One little quick question. Just anything you'd say for people who want to do the research on economics, if you squint your eyes, what are the things that economists kind of value the most when they come up with their, okay, this is good for the economy? A couple of things just to keep an eye out for.
Well, there are two things. One is, does the pie increase? Does the social welfare increases? And the second, who benefits and who doesn't benefit?
I guess I want to reinforce a point that Mr. Anand said about ease of use. I've been in the PC industry for 40 years. In the 70s, when we were first building PCs, no one thought you'd ever want to have one in your home, and they were too hard. In the 80s, I built some of the first online companies and some of the first internet companies. Nobody thought you would ever be online, and they were too hard. So as much as the technology is important for engineering students to go forward, we've got to make it easy to use or we'll never get mass adoption. So technology is important. I spent a lot of time building products and building applications, but we've got to always keep in mind on making that average user, Joe Sixpack, whatever you want to call him, be able to use this to really get to mass adoption.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example. I think most people who are involved in building products around Bitcoin think of ourselves with the internet in 1974, where we are building the new foundation of monetary protocol, and that if we solve digital scarcity, and again, people may disagree on what system is better, but I think it just presents a choice, Bitcoin or the legacy system, and if everyone agrees that the legacy system's good, we'll stick with that. But that as it relates to usability, if we solve digital scarcity, if we were able to create a system that had a reliably fixed supply where I could send all of you money today and not involve a single intermediary, and that people in Russia and China and Western Europe could all reconcile and accept those transactions, that's a profound thing. And that if that's where we're at today, then in 5 years or in 10 years or in 20 years, those issues of usability and scalability are much smaller problems to solve. And in many ways, we've already solved them with the legacy financial system. Like Bitcoin is fundamentally different than a Visa. Visa could theoretically sit on top of Bitcoin. It would require work. But the mechanisms of payments versus the underlying and fundamental currency are two different problems. So I think there's a lot of work and a lot of infrastructure that will continue to be built to solve those usability problems.
Parker, I just wanted to kind of just maybe clarify one thing. You said Visa today couldn't sit on top of Bitcoin.
Agreed.
Yeah, so I
Would require work.
would require so I really appreciate you saying that, and in the classes that I do, I stress technology is necessary but not sufficient, and I keep doing that.
Actually, I'm going to take a step forward and say people shouldn't even know they're using blockchain. When I am on the internet, I don't know what protocol I'm using. I'm just connecting to my bank on my website. I think the ultimate is like system is a system where you're not even knowing that you're using a decentralized system. You're not knowing like you're using a token or it just flows seamlessly.
I had a question. So what did you mean by Visa sitting on Bitcoin?
So there's a lot of different ideas of how Bitcoin will scale. So there's a certain limited throughput of transactions on the Bitcoin network. Think of it like a settlement layer. I think of it like the New York Fed. Transactions are cleared through the Fed. You may have no idea that the New York Fed exists. You swipe your Visa transaction, you have a bank, it processes the transaction, and at a later point in time, transactions are netted and settled in a batched way. And so what I meant was deciphering between Bitcoin, the currency, and a payments rail. And so it would require a network of banks, but if you thought about a Coinbase or a Gemini or people who operate as central custodians, the currency, rather than settling through the Fed, would settle on the blockchain. And that payments, such as a company like Visa or MasterCard, could sit on top of the banking infrastructure if they held Bitcoin much the same way as they hold dollars today. That when you swipe a Visa transaction, money doesn't actually go to Starbucks. It settles through the Fed at some later point in time, often in a batch transaction. And I think I mentioned this, but it's just kind of thinking about Bitcoin and the blockchain as that replacement for the Fed, not for Visa.
I think we have time for maybe one more question if anybody else.
The question of mass adoption, if you ask people out there, at least a while ago, their first internet provider was probably America Online. I mean, I can certainly remember when you could get those floppies anywhere. I mean, what do you think the AOL for crypto might look like? I mean, maybe that's what we need, although it might be kind of a watered down version, because I know I started on CompuServe, so, but which of course CompuServe wasn't as easy because they still use numerical names, and on AOL, you could actually make a real username.
Yeah, and I think if anybody's ever transacted or interacted directly with the blockchain, people certainly recognize that looking at a hardware wallet and reading off 32 characters in order to validate a transaction is not optimal. But I do think that either through APIs where kind of you're able to connect your wallet or your vault or your multi-sig apparatus with other users, that the operability will turn to your phone or devices that don't require you to independently read alphanumeric characters. So I think of it literally adopting in some form or fashion like the Visa network. That's the way that people will be swiping transactions. It may not be how they hold the majority of their money, but when they're facilitating payments, it will be just as seamless as the dollar system exists today, but there will be stacked layers that build on top of Bitcoin.
I love the analogy though, and we don't know, I don't know the answer to who is the AOL for the crypto world, but what a great business model. Like let's send in the mail, maybe some kind of mail, a Satoshi to someone and tell them to open up a wallet and get on the network. Let's try that. Maybe not a whole Satoshi, maybe a fraction of a Satoshi.
5 hours for $9.95 a month.
Yeah.
I'm going to give an answer that probably almost no one here is going to like it. The answer is Libra. Okay? Not many people are going to like it, but the answer is Libra. Let me tell you why the answer is Libra. And maybe not Libra, somebody else. The problem of mass adoption is a problem of coordination. So we all have to go on board on finding the same system. Can be Bitcoin or can be something else. Now, the reason why I'm saying Libra is because, 2 billion people are on Facebook, something like that. And so if one of these large players introduces this partially decentralized currency that people can easily use from their Facebook account, that is going to increase the mass adoption dramatically. Now, it's not going to be fully decentralized. It's a permissioned blockchain with only 25 members validating the transactions, but that's how you solve the coordination problem.
Yeah, I completely agree with Cesare on that, and I think they'll try to grow the membership as the time goes by.
And by the way, I'm not endorsing Libra, but I'm using Libra as an example of how you solve the coordination problem.
Yeah, and I actually agree with that, but for a different reason. I think that Libra, because it has 1 billion or 2 billion users, will cause everyone to become more interested than they are today. It will essentially be marketing for Bitcoin, and it provides an incredible contrast in a system. So it gets everybody's attention. It has Congress spooled up, but we've already seen for the people who are paying attention. One of the anchors on CNBC, he understood Bitcoin once he started comparing it to Libra, and for people that read the Libra white paper, they immediately recognize the distinction between the two, the points of centralization versus decentralization, the aspects of a fixed supply of a currency that's fundamental to a blockchain versus just building on top of the dollar. So I do agree. I just think it's going to be more marketing for Bitcoin and raise awareness. But I do think it's something, and Justin mentioned this, it may have a viable use case and very much is something like a Venmo.
Matt, we should end on this point of agreement.
That is a great idea, Tej. I want to take a moment to thank each of them for joining this panel. Can we give them a round of applause? I'm going to hand it over to Sriram Vishwanath, Texas Blockchain Org's key sponsor.
So folks, I'm between you and happy hour. And it's a Saturday. So I'm going to keep what I'm going to say really short because I realized what I have is a fairly detailed tech deck. And then a bunch of thank yous. So in a little bit of time, ideally I'm going to shoot for 15-20 minutes. I'm going to talk about some of the technology we're working on, and then I'm going to thank all the people who made this event possible, right? So I'm going to conclude in the next 20 minutes or so. So folks, I'm going to talk about a project called Spruce, and the main people behind Spruce who are working on it are, well, two of them are in this room. Actually, I'm hoping to see the third one as well. There's a bunch of are in this room, and the credit goes to them, right? This is research that they've been working on for the past, longer than I can remember. They've been working on it, and it is aimed at addressing two aspects. This is a technical presentation, but it's aimed at solving two aspects: scalability and decentralization, right? So how do you truly decentralize, not just pseudo-decentralized, partially decentralized that we were talking earlier, truly decentralize for Byzantine fault-tolerant systems? And then how do you scale it? When I say scale it, do tens of thousands of transactions per second. So again, I'm going to focus here on those two aspects, but I'm just going to give you a sample of it. Let me refer to the people who are working on it, who can give you a much better version than I can. And I know I'm on the right-hand side over there, but honestly, the four people listed here before me are the four people. They're the right people who can help answer a lot of questions going forward. So I'm going to skip the basics of how a proof of work system works, but I'm going to focus on one particular topic, which is called the longest chain rule. Now, just a quick poll. How many have heard of this thing called longest chain rule? A few of you. That's pretty good. So the longest chain rule is a rule that was developed for resistance to what's effectively called a 51%, 50+% majority attack. And it has driven a lot of the evolution of where proof blockchains, but generally blockchains are today. And so if you've never heard of this, it's a good terminology, LCR, longest chain rule. And it's part of asynchronous consensus. Now, by the way, before I go ahead, Byzantine fault tolerance. How many of you heard of that? Oh, a lot more. That's great. So if you haven't heard of Byzantine fault tolerance, there's a very nice article on it online. There's obviously papers. There's a famous paper by Leslie Lamport. There's other actually equally famous papers on what's called Byzantine faults and tolerance to them. An understanding of where this entire notion of decentralized consensus through doing some kind of proof mechanism, in this case proof of work, and why it satisfies, why it was a very clever solution, ingenious solution to solve a Byzantine fault problem is very well articulated in some papers, and I can give you references to that. But understanding why centralization versus decentralization was such a big challenge, whether it be databases, whether it be consensus protocols, whether it be ultimately incentivizing consensus, was such a big challenge. People have been studying that in distributed systems for decades. Even though we've talked about blockchains for the past 10 years and with more and more intensity, the study of decentralized consensus goes back decades. And what we got with Bitcoin and what blockchain has come out of from Bitcoin is this understanding of how you can solve the Byzantine fault problem in a truly decentralized way while providing resistance to attack patterns, particularly what's called the 51% attack. All right? So I'm not going to go into details on it, but I'm happy to give you references so you can read more. So traditionally, whether it be Bitcoin, whether it be Ethereum, whether it be any of the other folks, they come up with a proof function, and even today a majority are proof of work functions. So if you don't know what proof of work is, go along with me for the moment, but they go with something called a proof of work function. And double SHA is a pretty common one. It's what Bitcoin uses. So the way we think about things today is we come up with what's called a proof of work function. Right now, think of it as a hash function, and then build a blockchain. That's the order we think of things in, right? The problem with that is that companies, problem or benefit of that, the side effect of that, is that companies like Bitmain come about. How many have heard of Bitmain? Oh, okay, not a bad fraction. What does Bitmain do? They do ASICs, right? And what do the ASICs do? They accelerate that function. And they non-linearly accelerate that function. What does non-linear accelerate? That means the energy consumption per hash is non-linearly diminished, which means you can plug it in and you'll get many more hashes than a regular machine can produce. Now, what is the problem with generating a very vast number of hashes quickly in a proof of work system? Yes?
You get kind of an inordinate representation.
Yes, you get an inordinate control. Inordinate in that may not be majority, which is fine, but it's still inordinate in that it's truly not decentralized, right? So you get more resources than would scale naturally if that didn't occur. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but I'm telling you it has a centralizing effect, right? So let us say you wanted to rethink this, right? So today what do? We come up with a function, we implement a blockchain, and then somebody like Bitmain goes and says, I can build a chip for this, and then they start inordinately, bigger than normal, getting access to hash power, right? That's what happens today. I'm going to flip the whole thing for you, right? And I'm going to go exactly the opposite way. Okay. What is one of the most popular chips in the world? IC is not potato chips. Potato chips are the most popular chips in the world, but what might be a very popular IC in the world? Any guesses? The Intel x86, right? Is one of the most popular ICs in the world. And a bunch of other people do x86. Are you all familiar with the Intel x86? Have you? It's likely a device that you're carrying right now, right? Or AMD, or somebody else, or there's so many of these x86 architectures. If you've seen those, they're very, very standard. There's a couple of others that are very particularly popular, the Qualcomm Snapdragon, the RISC-V based, etc., etc. But let's take the Intel x86, great example. If you wanted fairness, now I'm telling you each one of you have multiple Intel x86 somewhere, right? If I wanted fairness, what would I do? I would enable you to be able to mine on Intel x86 in such a way that nobody can get an inordinate benefit, correct? Are you following my train of thought? If each one of you could be a miner and that nobody can make an ASIC better than the ASIC you already have, then what happens? Now I can talk about decentralization and fairness, right? Because suddenly a Bitmain cannot build a better ASIC that can take on and produce more hashes than you can non-linearly, meaning let's say you have 10 computers, you can do 10 times, that's good. The danger is if you have the equivalent of a bit main and can produce 1,000, million times, that's when you get inordinate power, right? So linear is fine. Okay, so that's the idea behind HashCore, right? So the idea behind HashCore is that you should not pseudo-centralize, you should not semi-centralize, you should not partially centralize. If you want to truly decentralize, each one of you should be able to mine. Now, do any of you remember SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence? Anybody? No. Okay, he does. You do. Do any of you know a program called FOLDIT, protein folding? Good, some of you do. What did they do? They did something interesting. They used your CPU to do something. What did they do? To do some of the computation in their spare time. Good. So think SETI and FOLDIT, okay? So what HashCore is going to do is it's going to produce a proof of work function for which CPU is the optimal ASIC. It's going to reverse the entire notion and put it on its head, okay? So it's going to make a provable proof of work function that cannot go any faster than an x86. In fact, if you need to speed it up, you'll have to design an x86 that's better than Intel, which is very hard to do given how, how many resources Intel has. Right? Does that make sense? So you have to beat Intel at its general purpose game, and AMD, and everybody else, to win. Right? So that is the whole notion, in that everybody has access to it, and because everybody has access to it, you design something that everybody can do best. And nobody without a major country's resources can make it any better. And if they do make it better, it'll lead to a better x86 processor. It's all good, right? Did that make sense? Okay. So the benefit is a competitive ASIC market. No entry barrier. You don't need a GPU. You don't need. You have the miner on you, right? Think of SETI and FOLDIT. You can use spare CPU cycles to mine, and it really leads to a modular proof of work function. And this is a very interesting piece, which is you can build modularity into your proof of work to be able to scale it and make it valuable, is the word I'd use, to the community. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead to scalability. I think scalability has been mentioned before, and I don't want to make a big deal out of it. Scalability is one of the top research issues in blockchain generally, in Bitcoin, particularly with BIPs. And now we want something that's tens of thousands of transactions per second. That would be freaking amazing, right? At a feast that really scales with the transaction count. And so comes the notion of block reduce. And the notion of block reduce is a very interesting notion. It's a notion where, now how many of you have heard of sharding? Sharding, there's so many white papers on sharding, different types of sharding. You shard state, you shard storage, you shard this, you shard that. Because ultimately, one of the ways in storage and in many databases, we learned to scale with sharding. So we took our notions of sharding and decided to apply to blockchain. In the process, much of sharding weakens the security of the chain. Remember the whole Byzantine fault tolerance? I want the same level of security. I don't want to compromise on security, but I still want tens of thousands of transactions a second. It's important, right? The reason we care about blockchain is there's a certain level of security that comes as a resilience to Byzantine faults, to attack patterns. And so, can I get something that has the same level of security, right, but still scales to tens of thousands of transactions, and will work with any proof mechanism, so I don't have to insist on staking. You can do proof of work. So I'm going to give you the cake, you can eat it too, and you can gift it to your friend, okay? I'm going to give you the following. I'm going to give you full security, and I'm going to give you scalability, and I'm going to give you proof of work, and I'm going to give you everything ultimately on a fully merged chain. Again, sounds very attractive. Is it doable? The answer is yes. And the way it's doable is not by messing with the essential elements of what makes blockchain secure, but by architecting the network and network compression in ways that can be hierarchically structured so you can ultimately reach distributed consensus much more efficiently in terms of number of bits. I know that was a long sentence. I'm happy to go into more detail in that. But the core notion is to be able to see that what you're effectively creating is a merged mind set of what we call zones, regions, and the ultimate prime that all work in a dynamic fashion, in a latency sensitive fashion, keeping in mind that what makes a decentralized system different from centralized is the latency of the interaction between the nodes. If it was centralized, what's the latency? 0, right? Or near 0. If it's decentralized, what's the issue? There's latency. There's partial information. You have something, the other person doesn't have it yet, and it's going to take some time getting there, given bandwidth. Okay? What a centralized system has is called consistency. You can have strict, or what's called absolute, consistency. A decentralized system does not have that. It has what's called eventual consistency because of the fact that things have to propagate. And they have to propagate in an efficient way. How to make that efficient at a network level is achieved through zones, regions, and ultimately prime, but not by separate chains. Ultimately, it's architected to merge mine, if you've never heard the term merge mine, please Google it, in a way that provides the same level of security at the end, but is able to support local interactions at a much higher rate than thought possible before, right? So I know I'm giving you a teaser of it, not the full details, but it is possible. And there's ways in which you can see the network as being think of it as a fractal. A network within a network within a network, where the innovation is in the network architecture, the way the network is structured, while the essence of security from proof of work still remains the same, right? So anyway, happy to side channel to talk more about it, but that's my last slide. And you already have my contact information. I know may have been a lot to take in, but there is information. There are 2 people in the audience, maybe more, Alan as well, but Jonathan there, Yanni there, who can speak way more cogently about what I talked about and are the main people behind Spruce. So, folks, this was actually the first Texas Blockchain Summit. I don't know if you realized that this is the first time we have done it. Anyway, so I say we, I'm giving myself credit. I don't deserve any credit at all right? This was done by Texas Blockchain. The students who are behind this, they're on this pamphlet. You can see the names. Alan, Preston, Jake, Matt, James, Griffin, Shelby, and Bill. So they made it all possible. All the credit for it goes to them. And any improvement opportunities, any feedback, we'd welcome that very much. I also want to thank UT Cockrell School for giving us the space. The Cockrell School has been pretty awesome in letting us, on a Saturday, use the space, not just this one, but also the breakout room and all the other facilities. I also want to thank you for taking the time on a Saturday, for coming here, spending time with us, and for being such a good audience. So thank you very much. And lastly, I want to thank the speakers. I attended, there were some very healthy debates. I attended some talks, but I actually learned quite a bit, which I enjoyed very much. So thank you, everybody, for staying till this hour on a Saturday with us. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on my talk or on Texas blockchain offline. Oh, okay.
Well, I wasn't sure if you were open to questions.
Let me do this. Let me wrap up here. We can do questions one-on-one. All right. All good? All right. I believe there's still a happy hour thing going on. Anybody know?
Yeah, there is. I'm not sure where.
Okay. I don't know the details. I'm sure outside. If not, we'll just informally do happy hour. I look forward to talking to all of you. Hey. Oh, nice to meet you.
Where do we get more details on that?
Yeah.